Hello, everybody. You know, it's very hard for an American audience to hear anything about foreign affairs without understanding something about how the United States became and remains an international world power, and what it is we've done and what it is and the reason we've done it. It casts everything we hear about in terms of going abroad and doing good things or bad things in historical context. There's sort of a tortured history in internationalism versus isolationism, if I can use those two as extremes, that make it somewhat difficult for us to figure out whether we're being progressive or being regressive in the way we deal with the rest of the world. We know that our guest today, who will be introduced in just about 3 minutes, which I will speed through my notes, is how we look upon that without thinking about the concomitants of the presence of foreign, particularly Eurocentric powers in third world countries. Whether we are going overseas to alleviate suffering, for economic development, for expansion of markets, for search for cheap labor, for creation of diplomatic and military alliances, all of these have formed an important role of America's place in the world. And of course, America itself began with a schizophrenic worldview. George Washington's farewell address in 1796, which he had written in 1792 and had rewritten a dozen times apparently before he finally decided he didn't want a third term as president, which talked about avoiding foreign allegiances and entanglements, was very clear that the United States was going to set a different path in the world. We would not get involved in the disputes. In those days, Europe was the rest of the world for the American colonists, including the involvement of wars between different monarchical families, the intrigues of Europe that were corrupting and not part of the New World, and also to avoid the coming wars between France and England, which Washington was convinced the Jeffersonians on one side and the Federalists on the other side very much wanted us to get involved in the wars in Europe. And as was proven in 1812, almost would have destroyed America, at least at the end of the 18th century, had we done so. But ever since then, America has been excited about either getting involved in or extracting itself from international affairs. And if I just skip ahead 100 years, because this is not my presentation, this is your presentation, Woodrow Wilson's important role in so-called positivist foreign policy, that we can do good by doing stuff abroad, and his 14 points that he thought would end World War I and create an era of world peace, was something that to this day is being disputed, whether America should be playing a prominent foreign role and what should that role be. And so those discussions continued to my childhood as a college student, and I look upon, excuse me, there's a college student in the room? I look upon my years as the undergraduate years as my childhood, as you will too, and you're approaching my age, and the war in Vietnam and what that did in terms of splitting not only conservative movements in the United States, but splitting progressive movements. And in fact, I recall very well, because I was in the middle of some of the debates with the ILO, the fights between the Meanyites and the Rutherites. The Meanyites arguing George Meany supporters of the AFL-CIO, arguing that America's involvement in Vietnam was a progressive movement because it was protecting the nascent labor union movement in South Vietnam. Ever heard of that movement? Well, in any event, it apparently was there then, and Meany supported the war in Vietnam, whereas Walter Reuther strongly opposed the war, saying that it diverted American resources from alleviating conditions in this country, creating fair labor practices, and would imprison a generation of Americans to fight overseas in a war of imperialist aggression. Walter Reuther, in fact, was called worse than Karl Marx by Barry Goldwater, for those of you who remember who Barry Goldwater was. So these were not gentle cocktail party discussions. These were life and blood discussions and arguments in the United States. In the field of history, historians became split, and a progressive movement and a reactionary movement grew up there as well. And in fact, that's very much a part of American historiography. Charles Beard, I guess, is probably the most famous of the progressives, who wrote his economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States and argued that America's evolution was not because of love of liberty, rather it developed a legal system to protect property of the wealthy. And Charles Beard, in turn, then became a major intellectual forebear of William Appleman Williams, who applied that to American foreign policy in his book Tragedy of American Diplomacy, in which he argued that America's history was not one of spreading freedom around the world, but rather of spreading American empire around the world, and argued that America should withdraw from international, or to a substantial degree, withdraw from American involvement. And after that, you had that great outpouring of anti-Vietnam historians. You had people like Lloyd Gardner at Rutgers, who to this day remains a friend of mine, who published not only his anti-Vietnam work, but also his book on World War I, that talked about America's involvement in World War I and what we hope to gain from it. And other important names, Walt Lefebvre from Cornell, who did the same, Ronald Steele, who wrote Pax Americana, and other works like that. But today what we're faced with is whether we can have a progressive and beneficial influence over world affairs and how we can do that. We have, and one of the great fights we have now are between people who subscribe to notions of relativism in understanding morality. And that is, you can't really judge something good or evil unless you understand the social and historical contexts within which they arise. And so we should be slow to criticize what other nations are doing or other conditions around the world until we understand how they arose. And contrary to that, there are people who still maintain certain moral absolutes, like how could it be right to subject people to dengue fever? How could it be right to support female genital mutilation? How could it be right to support to support honor killing? And so those are the issues that we continue to battle about, and a lot of it goes back to the foundation of the United States. And what are the role of American institutions that say we must get involved abroad because how dare we not, when knowing that American projection of force or even private American groups overseas come with it certain kinds of toxic medications that follow. And that includes what America has done in the world as part of being a world power. Perhaps we are a better steward of world power than some of the other superpowers we've come across, but certainly it is not an unmixed record. And so as we look at current structures, including private structures, such as the Gates Foundation, such as the Clinton Global Initiatives, such as the Carter Center, that we all praise because they do alleviate world suffering, what does it mean in terms of American boots overseas? And can it ever be good? Can it ever be avoided? And what kind of moral principles should we follow in order to attenuate the harm we can do and promote to the extent possible the good we can do? And finally, the last cynic's question is, are the most principled people the most dangerous people? I'm sorry to raise this question, but are the most principled the most dangerous? That they're people who know what's right. And one thing international diplomacy has never had is a shortage of people who really knew what was right. And sometimes to the betterment, and sometimes to the great suffering and destruction of world cultures and people's way of life. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome you to this great event, and I'd like to recognize our Vice President for Academic Affairs for a few words of welcome, as she will. Thank you. Tresmaine.
Thank you, Rich, and welcome again, everyone. I will be brief so that we can get to the speaker of the hour. I think all of us who are faculty and on the staff here and students all recognize the tremendous importance of the work you do and the tremendous importance of understanding peace and how we can achieve peace in the world. And as part of our mission here, we want our students to understand something about how small the world is and how much we all need one another in it. And it is our hope that events like these will begin to stimulate the consciousness of everyone on our campus, to begin to look at ways to be peace, not just speak about it. And so with that, I move out of the way.
Thank you, Dean Grimes. I'm really delighted to be welcoming Andrew and Ursula Tomlinson to Bloomfield College, and to introduce Andrew as the first Holley guest lecturer since I've been honored to step into the role of Holley professor. This has been a wonderful year, and this is, for me, a lovely conclusion to all the work of this year. Andrew Tomlinson has had a breadth and depth of experience in history, politics, religion, and finance. He received first-class honors at the University of Cambridge in archaeology and anthropology with a focus on India and Mesopotamia. He was also a choral scholar at his college, St. John's. His master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania is in Oriental Studies with work in Indian archaeology, art history, and ancient languages, both Akkadian and Sanskrit. He was at Penn on a Turan scholarship, and those scholarships promote Anglo-American relations by generously granting up to 2 years of postgraduate study. He was vice president at S.G. Warburg and Company, working in their London and New York offices in investment banking, equity capital markets, corporate derivatives, and fixed income capital markets. And I certainly do wish that well, this is for the benefit of our economics professor, this wealth of details. He was a director at Solomon Smith Barney, a division of Citigroup, where he was a senior member of the derivatives capital markets team working with Fortune 500 companies. And he founded and was president of the Dillman One Fund, a socially responsible investment fund. For the past 8 years, he has been the director of the Quaker United Nations office in New York and Quaker representative to the UN. This office has been in New York since 1947 with a focus on peace building and the prevention of violent conflict. In June 2013, the organization Action on Armed Violence named the Quaker UN office under the leadership of Andrew Tomlinson in New York and Jonathan Woolley in Geneva as one of the 100 most influential global actors in armed violence reduction. In a document titled Doing That Which Tends to the Peace of All, Andrew examines how Quaker concepts frame practices of service at the UN. It isn't really possible to do justice to that essay in the time that I have, but certain passages in it resonate with his topic, and also with views of teaching and learning that I think many of you are going to find familiar and that you share with me. He writes, "Our understanding at any moment is only preliminary, is necessarily incomplete, at best, an approximation of the truth. And we always need to be open to new insight." He also writes of the Quakers' engagement in transformation through relationships. Quote, "The qualities of integrity, inclusivity, and fellow feeling seem to create trust. And fellow feeling leads to a strong basis for being able to reach out across divides. The Quakers' belief of God in everyone provides the impulse and the humility to build bridges. And integrity provides the strength to be able to take and maintain an independent position despite being pulled in other directions. One of the fruits of Quaker practice is hope. The belief, he says, that there is an answer, a true understanding beyond the scope of our current approximation of knowledge and in the transformative potential of new insights." I'd like to return to a detail that I mentioned earlier. I said that Andrew was a choral scholar at St. John's, and music was actually the occasion of our meeting. I was living in Massachusetts, and Andrew was performing at Amherst College as a member of the ensemble Pomerium Musicis, which was an ensemble dedicated to presenting vocal music of the Renaissance. The singing you heard before we began today, before all the hubbub of conversation at least, was actually by that group. It's this CD. Though Andrew is not one of the singers on this particular recording. But I'm highlighting this not just to show you how interesting and how talented our speaker is, but actually to draw attention to how different parts of Andrew's life are threaded together. I think of how music can cross barriers of language and culture, how it can move people despite their differences, how the harmony and balance of human voices can embody and also be a metaphor for the harmony and balance of personal and local and global relations. And so while he will not be singing this afternoon, I hope that you will welcome Mr. Andrew Tomlinson.
Well, thank you. After an introduction like that, it's hard to see how anything I do can be anything but a letdown. So I'm sorry. It's probably much better to arrange a really glum sort of introduction so that then anything I say could actually be rather more interesting and entertaining. But in any event, President Laval, Dean Grimes, Professor Puccio, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be back in New Jersey. We lived for many years in Montclair, and my daughter is here today, lives just a few blocks away in Bloomfield. So it's really nice to reconnect here. So today I've been asked to talk about values and transformation in international policy settings. But before I dive in, I'd like to set the scene a little bit to give you a sense of the context that I work in. And I'll start by telling a couple of stories. So when I first came to work at the Quaker United Nations office almost 10 years ago, my new colleagues hosted a reception for me as the incoming director. And as is customary at these things, I was expected to give a little speech. And as a newcomer, I did want to make sure that I didn't embarrass my colleagues by saying anything more than usually uninformed or inappropriate. And so what I settled on in the end was to start off by reading from the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations, which was, of course, signed in San Francisco in 1945, because I wanted to root my remarks in those principles on which the UN still stands. And this is what I read. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, have agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations. Now, what struck me most at the time is when I looked around the room at this group of diplomats and UN officials, that some of those present had their eyes closed. Now, not I think because they were napping. It seemed like it was a bit early in the afternoon for that to be happening. But because, actually, as I was later to appreciate, the Charter for some of them is almost a religious document, a sacred text in a largely secular setting. And it was a useful lesson to me that I've never really forgotten, that in the midst of that complexity, of the politics and the bureaucracy of the UN setting, that the people in that room, from all over the world, of many different religions or none, could draw a sense of purpose and a sense of community from the words of the UN Charter. Now, the second story came about some months later, when I was meeting with an ambassador for a Middle East member state in his office at the end of a busy day. And I was there to discuss a possible meeting with the president of his country with a group of civil society organizations during an upcoming visit. And for 10 minutes or so, we talked about policy and logistical issues. And then somehow or other, the conversation took a different course. And I found myself in a heartfelt discussion about the direct relationship between individuals and God, both in Christian and Muslim theology, but also as a matter of direct personal experience. And then after 20 minutes or so, we just went back to our previous discussion. And coming out of that meeting, I marveled that to this particular individual, but who's not alone in this, that the world of government and business on the one hand, and the world of spirituality and the values and beliefs were seamlessly connected. They were not separated. And that the basic existential framing of the separation of church and state that I'd grown up with was simply not present for him in the same kind of a way. So coming to the UN, I'd clearly found myself in an environment where values were important, although in ways that were quite complicated. And it's hard to express what a complete contrast that was for me. As you've heard, for the previous 20 years, I'd been a banker, employed by big financial organizations in London and in New York, working weekends and long hours in an environment which was occasionally values challenged, perhaps. And where efforts were also largely individually focused. It was all about, yourself, with little sense of acting for a greater objective. But as a practicing Quaker, I'd for a while been looking for a work environment where I could better connect with the things that were important to me, where values had a role, and apparently had found it. So before going any further, I should say a few words about the UN itself and what Quakers are doing there anyway. So the United Nations is the principal and most representative forum where the world's governments come together to engage with one another on global issues and concerns. There are many other international groupings and organizations, but the UN is where all 193 nations have a voice, and where agreements are worked out on issues such as climate change. So, for example, last Friday saw lockdown security in Turtle Bay for the signing of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, in a week that also saw a General Assembly special session on drugs and a high-level thematic on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and also in a month where the Security Council, under the Chinese presidency, has been considering actions on Syria, on Burundi, terrorism, South Sudan, and the future of UN peacebuilding. And of course, this is about 15 miles in wherever that direction is from here. This is very close to where we are right now. Now, the UN acts where there is agreement among the international community. Where such agreement does not exist, then the UN doesn't act. It's as simple as that. But it's as if you took all of the branches of the US government and stripped away everything except the Senate. So no House of Representatives, no meaningful judiciary, no constitution, no standing army or police force, and a largely powerless executive branch. The remarkable and rather wonderful thing about the UN is actually that anything gets done at all. And that, and that not every decision is driven purely by national interest in a realpolitik kind of a way, but there is actually space for actions that benefit everyone, for altruism and for humanity, that is, for values. Now, there are three communities at the UN. There are diplomats representing their governments, there are UN officials who are international civil servants, and civil society, particularly in the form of non-governmental organizations or NGOs. Now, all of the major humanitarian and development organizations are represented there, like Oxfam and CARE and Médecins Sans Frontières, human rights organizations like Amnesty International, and also faith-based organizations like the Quakers. And these NGOs spend their time trying to influence the policy decisions being made by the diplomats and implemented by the UN officials. Now, the Quakers have been at the UN, as we've noted, since 1947, when it had really only just been decided that UN would actually be in New York. So it was before the iconic buildings went up, when diplomats and officials were just arriving and starting to grapple with the challenge of how to implement the grand vision laid out in the UN Charter. Which is to say that we've been at the UN for longer than most member states. The original list was only 51 countries. And for a small group committed to changing the world, to making it a more peaceful, just, and inclusive place, the UN offers unique advantages. For the Quakers, with a focus on peace and justice, the UN is the forum where the international community comes together in responding to violent conflict and large-scale violations of human rights, and in agreeing priorities for post-conflict reconstruction, humanitarian relief, and development and sustainability. It is also the place where global norms, standards, and practices on peace and justice issues are debated and set, which then impact the behavior of governments and other actors thereafter. And the UN plays a significant direct and coordinating role in many of the regions and countries that are impacted by poverty and violence. So on a day-to-day basis, the work of our small office in New York, along with our colleagues in Geneva, and in partnership with the American Friends Service Committee, our sister organization, is to engage and influence UN policymakers. As our 2016 program review states, we strive towards international standards and practices that enable and empower peaceful social, political, and economic relationships. And for us, working with the UN provides tremendous leverage in doing just that. So that's the background to my remarks. And now I'd like to go a little deeper. So I plan to focus on 3 observations that come from the experience that I and my colleagues and predecessors have had in working in this unique environment for almost 70 years. So first, that values are a legitimate and effective entry point for policy work. Second, that progress is often made through engaging with the inconsistencies in the values that people hold. And third, that fostering values-based change requires us to design a range of different strategies. I should also say at this point that I'm not an academic, nor an expert in ethics, or probably anything else for that matter. And so these observations and my reflections are simply drawn from this direct experience of working as a values-based organization at an international policy level at the UN. So let's look at each of the 3 items in turn. The first observation, that values are a legitimate and effective entry point, stems from an analysis that suggests that values shape policymakers' inspiration, motivation, strategies, and methodologies, which is to say, the reasons why they do what they do and how they do it, particularly in situations where they have flexibility to act independently of national positions. Indeed, in practice, in international negotiations, it can be suggested that international standards and actions emerge at the intersection of values and national interest. And when I say international standards and actions, that might be human rights norms or standards on criminal justice or development policy, and actions can include Security Council actions or more broadly UN activities in developing and conflict-affected countries around the world. A good example of this would be the negotiations around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 1940s. There were strong national interests at stake, often expressed as competing ideologies, with the US and others in the West pushing for civil and political rights, and Russia and China and others emphasizing economic and social rights. But in the midst of that, there were also genuine attempts, not least by Eleanor Roosevelt, to articulate a broadly acceptable set of standards that would protect the weak and stand the test of time. We see national interest most vividly on display these days in matters of peace and security, where the use of the Security Council veto means that in practice there are countries that simply cannot be discussed, particularly those connected with Russia, China, and the US, and situations where progress cannot be made, such as Syria. But national interest is also important in a wide variety of multilateral negotiations. Now, where a diplomat has strong instructions from capital, they may have little or no flexibility, but in other cases, and on less controversial subjects, they may have considerable leeway. It is also the case that national negotiating positions themselves may have some flexibility built in and can change over time. But what about facts? I mean, I've talked here about values and national interest, but I am, after all, talking in an academic institution. And surely isn't the heart of impacting policy decisions all about analysis and finely tuned arguments? Surely a keenly structured, finely reasoned, and well footnoted paper can change the world. Well, much as I love analytic work in an academic environment, I nearly became an academic myself, I would suggest that in the policy world, the answer is not necessarily. Indeed, it's often the case that facts and analysis impact policy decisions only to the extent that they change the values of policymakers and those who influence them. To think about climate change as an example. So anthropocentric climate change is established science, but there are plenty of leading US politicians and others who deny it for ideological reasons. Now, eventually, facts and analysis can influence belief and values, and in the long term, they can be important drivers of policy change. But the gap can be profound and long-lasting between analysis and action. And this, by the way, is also why doing good research is obviously a good thing, but is also not enough. You know, I can write a fabulous paper on how to bring peace to the world, but unless I've got a strategy to follow through, not only to disseminate the information, but to engage target audiences in a way that connects with them and with their values, with what they believe, then I may be disappointed by how little impact I have. Facts and analysis can be helpful, but they are insufficient in themselves. Now, in an international policy context, the values that a diplomat brings to the table can have a variety of roots. The precedent of existing international standards and agreements is important, and an appeal to relevant precedent is always a powerful argument in negotiations. Political ideologies, and indeed religious belief, also contribute to the mix, as does personal experience. Indeed, values derived from personal experience can be particularly strong, which is why it's important to link theoretical policy discussions to negotiators' own experience wherever possible, and to expose policy makers to the lived realities of the people affected by the decisions that they are making. So now the second observation, that progress is often made through engaging with the inconsistencies in values that people hold, enshrines a number of ideas. First, it's rarely the case that the sets of values held by an individual or a group are entirely consistent. Indeed, inconsistency seems the norm. And frequently, we apply values inconsistently as well. Human beings seem to crave absolutism, whether for themselves or for others. How often do we turn on the TV and hear people talking about what those Muslims believe, or men talking about how women think? But the reality, and that takes us a long way from reality, right, is that not only are individual and group value sets far less homogeneous than they are often portrayed, but human beings happily hold values that are inconsistent or even in conflict with one another. And we can exemplify this very simplistically with maxims. Thus, we can commend our own caution by recalling, "Look before you leap," at least until we remember that he who hesitates is lost. And in application, we may take comfort from inconsistency by remembering that one man's meat is another man's poison, until someone reminds us that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. But this inconsistency applies at a group level and at a national level as well. Here in the US, the framers of the Declaration of Independence made much of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as inalienable rights. But we have yet to see those rights applied consistently to all persons, irrespective of gender, color, and wealth. And that example also points towards one of the key working strategies of values-based policy work, which is identifying areas where core values, particularly humanitarian ones, are inequitably and inconsistently applied. Second, at the level of working methods, these inconsistencies offer points of entry for discussion and the potential for finding areas of common experience or concern. Even for groups whose formal expressions of belief, be they manifestos or creeds or vision statements, appear entirely different, it's usually the case that in practice there are some values, particularly fundamental ones, that overlap. This also implies that no presumptions can be made that an individual or a group should be excluded from a discussion, or for that matter, from a peace negotiation, because of their apparently incompatible values. Third, inconsistencies and inadequacies of value sets can also present in the form of ethical policy dilemmas, which are often very rich areas for group reflection and collaboration. For example, one time-honored way of encouraging the departure of a dictator or a belligerent armed actor is to offer them a golden handshake. Retirement to a home somewhere with a friendly government where they can live out their lives in comfort. On the one hand, such an approach gets them out of the way, perhaps putting a stop to whatever oppression and violence that they may have been involved in. But on the other, such treatment, offering impunity in this way, flies in the face of justice and sets bad precedent. I mean, this may seem theoretical, but with the limited means of persuasion at the disposal of the international community in any event, it's actually a frequent and critical dilemma. How does the international community encourage somebody like a Coney, leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, to leave the bush, or a despotic head of state to step down if all that is on offer for them is a trial at the International Criminal Court and imprisonment? So inconsistencies and dilemmas, although they may appear problematic, they may appear like hurdles, actually can be entry points for discussion, for creative solutions to appear, and for change to take place. Now, the third observation was that fostering values-based change requires us to design different strategies. Because if we accept the premise that values are a useful entry point into policy work, then it follows that we need to design strategies for engagement with policymakers that are designed to open up values-based discussion. Now, there are as many policy advocacy strategies as there are organizations doing policy work. But what I'd like to do here is just to highlight some of the strategies that we have found effective and which we believe to be consistent with this idea of values as an important entry point. Because if we are to engage with policymakers where they are, then the starting point is to listen. To try to understand where your interlocutor is coming from. And this is something that Quakers have been doing for a long time. Listen to this quote from the diaries of John Woolman, an American friend born, as it happens, in New Jersey in 1720, as he considered engaging in a different way with American Indians. A concern arose to spend some time with the Indians, that I might feel and understand their life and the spirit they live in, if haply I might receive some instruction from them, or they might be in any degree helped forward by my following the leadings of truth among them. And note that this approach is based on humility. It's based on listening first, of seeking to understand and learn, and only then moving on to consider the possibility that we might have something to contribute as well. And this is very much an inside strategy, and it's worlds away from more oppositional name and shame approaches. Now, by definition, a strategy based on listening requires one-on-one or small group meetings, at least in the early stages. And it's not a coincidence that the main program spaces in the Quaker UN offices in New York and Geneva are home-like, a living room and a dining room, ideal for small group work. Indeed, to get diplomats and officials to engage at a values level, it's essential to create a safe environment where our counterparts can feel able to move beyond national negotiating positions and connect in a different way. And so, for example, to foster this, most of our meetings are done on an off-the-record basis. You're not going to read about them in the press or see them on TV. It's also been our experience that small group meetings can be structured in such a way as to favor the possibility of transformative outcomes, which is simply to say, to create an environment where ideas can emerge that no one brought into the room with them. Now, this requires not only a safe space, but open-ended structuring of the meeting and active facilitation to to draw out quieter voices and different perspectives. It's not always easy, but it certainly can only happen if the ground is well prepared and the space opened. We've also found it useful to engage as much as possible at the level of fundamental values and direct experience, rather than at a theoretical level. We have found that making connections to policymakers' own life experiences or exposing them to the personal reality of those impacted by their decisions, for example, by bringing local partners to New York, is particularly effective. And above all, our experience has been that the manner in which we go about our work and interactions with diplomats, UN officials, and civil society is as important over the long term as are the program choices of the day. Peace and justice work requires of us that we conduct ourselves peacefully and justly. As we call for people to be treated with respect and dignity, we need ourselves to treat others accordingly. A phrase that we use to describe this approach is that the means are the ends in the making, that the how is as important as the what. But what does this look like in practice? Well, here are a couple of examples. As you may be aware, last fall, the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, 17 goals and 169 targets for wiping out poverty, eliminating inequality, promoting sustainability, bringing peaceful and inclusive societies, and tackling climate change. I should say the aspirations of this thing are enormous. I mean, Goal 1 is eliminate extreme poverty in all its forms everywhere. And that's just the first one of 17, and we've got 15 years to do it. Right? So you have to fasten your seatbelts for the activity here. Anyway, these Sustainable Development Goals expand on the Millennium Development Goals, which expired at the end of last year, and are universal in application. So they're meant to apply just as much as to Norway and the US as to, say, Burundi or Timor-Leste. And over the past few years, CUNO has worked to ensure that the goal of promoting peaceful and inclusive societies was included in the final version. But there was substantial political resistance to the idea of including issues as controversial as good governance and more inclusive decision-making. So an approach that we used consistently was to appeal to basics, that violence is a fundamental dimension of human suffering, as much part of the lives of the poorest as poverty and hunger. And although apparently very simple, we found that this approach has a strong resonance with many constituencies. For anyone with experience of environments of extreme poverty, whether in villages or in cities, in their own countries or elsewhere, this proposition actually seems self-evident. Connecting to both fundamental values and direct experience, this framing cut through much of the political noise around the peace issues and had the effect of changing the discussion from whether peace would be included to how it should be addressed. In another example, my colleagues in Geneva and Bonn worked for 2 years with negotiators around the process that led up to the recent Paris Agreement on climate change. Their primary program tool was to arrange a series of small dinners, quiet conversations with delegates selected across the range of negotiating blocs. They structured each dinner so as to emphasize the common ground between delegates, basing each gathering around a small number of questions, of queries. And these could be as simple as, what kind of a future would you like to see for your grandchildren? Very simple. But the impact over time was to increase the flow of novel ideas and ways forward, and to reinforce in delegates' minds the notion that they had the potential of working together to identify approaches to one of the greatest challenges of our time, rather than squaring off through repeated statements of national positions. So in our experience, strategies that have been effective in values-based work include listening, reaching out, making connections to real people's lives, and creating safe spaces for new ideas to emerge. To conclude then, our work over many decades at the United Nations suggests that first, values are a legitimate and effective entry point for policy works, and I would say that's where change starts, that progress is often made through engaging with the inconsistencies in the values that people hold, and that fostering values-based change requires us to develop different strategies that, at least for us, include listening, reaching out, making connections to real people's lives, and creating safe spaces for new ideas to emerge. So then to finish, I'd like to read you one more quote from the writings of Duncan Wood, one of the early directors of our sister office in Geneva, on the role of accompanying policymakers at the UN in a way that is rooted in values, yet takes into account the complexity and constraints on those making the decisions. I quote, "Since we are not in a position of power, the dilemmas are not ours to solve, the choices not ours to make. From time to time, we may be brought close to those who do have to find the solutions and make the choices. And on such occasions, it may or may not be given to us to make suggestions which promote the better of two choices or solutions. But it is more important that we express our conviction that decisions affecting the lives of multitudes cannot be dictated by worldly expedients, but must be taken, as we would express it, under concern. We must not suppose that those in authority are unaware of this, but we must recognize that their liberty of action is often circumscribed by the nature of their office. The powerful are not necessarily free. We who are freer than they are to follow what we believe to be right may at times be called upon to stand beside them as they seek for light on the road to peace." Thank you. So I believe we may have some time for questions. Yes, so please, the floor is open. Yes.
Andrew, how do you expose the people that you're talking to, other than bringing somebody right there, to what the impact is of what they're doing, they're deciding at that moment? Photography and video and all the media seems like one possibility, but I don't know what is that.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I mean, whatever you can do to make a direct connection. Certainly, the problem often is time. So yes, you can do the video things, but to get someone to come to a sitting of an hour and a half, movie or documentary or something can be really hard. Whereas somehow it's more of a draw very often to bring someone. I mean, as we have, in fact, the last 2 days, we've had someone from Burundi with us and actually meeting with a Rindemit, with the Secretary General Envoy's office for the Great Lakes, and with a variety of other diplomats and others, because then, particularly if you've worked with that person and helped them work through how to express that experience, because if you're taking someone who's doing community level work in Central Africa, take them into the middle of New York, into a conference room with policymakers, and expect them to be able to talk to one another, it doesn't happen automatically, right? You really have to work almost with both sides to help to bring the perspectives together. I think also finding ways to, even if there's anything where you can make a connection with something in the person themselves. That link, and of course, we're talking about people from many, many places around the world who actually quite often will have somewhere in their experience, and maybe their personal experience, something where you can make that sort of connection. So I think it's almost whatever tool you can find that will do it. And but sometimes, yes, the visual can be extremely important, and we've done photo exhibits of different sorts in Quaker House, and shorter videos. Sometimes, whatever you can do. It's still a very sort of staid environment, a little bit, the UN. People have not switched so much onto social media in some ways as the rest of us may have done. But I think those tools are actually starting to happen as well, and I think we will see some transformations of that. The other part of it, of course, where social media particularly can be very useful, is then building external social movements to what people like us are doing inside. So matching inside strategies and outside strategies are really important. And a number of times we've worked with partners outside, so you may get people demonstrating or doing whatever it is that needs to be done to really to raise some of the pressure from the outside. Well, we can be working on the inside as well in tandem. So I'm not saying one strategy is better than the other at all. At best, they're complementary. Right? And it's in those sorts of areas and in the social movements and the organizing side of things where really the digital and the video and the social media tools can be hugely important. Please.
Your office has been in existence for close to 70 years. What are some of the successes that you've had over those 70 years? Over those 70 years, there are things that your office has felt really good about. What are some of those things?
Just a couple in sort of different areas. One of them was child soldiers. So it's an issue that we're now more familiar with, but 25 years ago, the whole concept, the category of thinking and action that encompasses had not been thought about. And it was something that our offices and some others, some psychologists and therapists and others literally went into the field, documented a lot of these cases of, 8 to 12-year-old boys and girls being forced to act as soldiers, being act, of course, in different, being act to be people's wives for soldiers and so on, both actually in some cases in formal armies, but also particularly in rebel groups. And the trauma involved in that is unimaginable. And so that was one particular issue which we were proud of bringing to the table. I think another one, our Geneva office has done a long-term work around criminal justice issues, and particularly on the rights of women prisoners. Now, there are more men than women in prisons all over the world, but as happens in these cases, so many of the systems are actually designed for the men rather than the women. So we have these horrendous cases of people giving birth in shackles and all of this kind of stuff. So the needs of women in prison, first of all, and then the needs of the children of prisoners. And they've been also picking up work recently on the effects on the children of prisoners sentenced to death. And so there is this part of this, some of the work is connected with sort of responses to immediate big things happening, or outbreaks of violence, whatever it is. Some of it is this longer term, consistent sort of chipping away at issues, because if the standards get set at the UN, then the next country come along to write their constitution or whatever, goes to those standards to look, and so automatically it clicks into place. So that's a couple of examples. Please. So it's a really interesting and critical question, and there are several elements of answer, I think. One is it's important that there are frameworks, at least, which are set out and have broad legitimacy internationally, which set out basic principles of economic justice. Implementation is a different thing, and we'll get onto it, but at least so that the statements of principle should be there. I mean, if we think about it, I referred to the Declaration of Independence. That was rather a long time ago, and we're still working on it, right? So the UN Charter was 1945. So we've got a little more time, perhaps, on the way these seem to work. But something like this new framework of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development has actually broken new ground. So, for example, there's a big focus on inequalities. And inequalities, both economic and political, but interestingly, not just inequalities of opportunity, but also inequalities of outcome, which is really, which is a big debate, right? And it's very interesting then to get, at least in those documents, those kinds of things starting to appear. Now, there are at a global level, there are questions that relate to economic justice. We obviously are still feeling the effects of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which for most of the developing world, they perceived as an irresponsible breakdown of the world financial system by powers that should know better. And it's actually not a bad analysis when you go back and look at it. And there are also still within the global trade rules and things like this, it's still very hard for a developing country to get ahead, because by all sorts of protective standards and other things, there are ways in which the rich country keep products from the developing countries out and away from them. There are even issues at that level on financial flows. So there was an extraordinary report last year, the Mbeki report on financial flows in Africa, which suggested that actually Africa is a net contributor to the global economy if it wasn't for the $50 billion plus or minus that gets illicitly moved out of the economy, particularly by transfer pricing from Western corporations. So they'll make sure that none of their profits appear in Africa where it might get taxed, and they'll run it through a couple of tax havens in the middle, and gosh, it never seems to get taxed at all. So there's all of these, and these are big pieces that take a long time to move around. The good things that we have, at least some moves, for example, in the voting at the World Bank and the IMF, which is moving a little bit away from the people who were just dominating the world in the 1940s, which it's all about. Now, then you've got the bottom up, and then you've got what can be done actually in countries all around the world, both just where the poorest countries are, but then also within countries. And we have countries like Angola, right? So if you look purely at GDP, looks like they're doing great, and they've got oil. The problem is that it's one of the most unequal places on earth, and none of that money actually trickles down to 95% of the population. So it's both about doing things at a global level and trying to find ways to encourage things to be done differently within countries as well. At least with the 2030 Agenda, we have a framework where a lot of that stuff is named. Implementation requires both money at a time when the world kind of doesn't have any, and there are one or two other things out there like climate change and so on. Political will, and all of those good things, which is just, I think, going to take time. But I think it's better than it was, but there's an awful long way to go. Please.
As a casual observer, have you seen that maybe the Gulf War that the UN has had a lower profile? Is that the sense from the organization?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Depending on the topic, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Think about two different worlds, though, for a minute. Because on one hand, there's the whole peace and security side of things. Right? And that's where the headlines come from, to some degree. And there, of course, I mean, the UN, in different ways, has been very much involved with the sort of the crises of the day. everything from the Ukraine to Syria to northern Iraq and beyond. But one must always remember that the UN's actions are simply, that's really the forum where the international community is acting. So if we ever get to the point of, well, the UN isn't doing this or is doing that, it's really about the international community is unable to do this or is doing badly that or whatever it is. So in some ways, the UN is the stage on which particularly the interstate rivalries that we see playing out in Syria, for example, happen. And they happen in the Security Council, and there's a quarterly meeting which goes on all day and sometimes into the night on Middle East issues, which is wonderful to read the transcripts of, because it's the nearest we get to back to the days of sort of banging shoes on desks and things like that. It's amazing quite how rude these people are willing to be to one another in public. But if we move away from the peace and security side, even the last year has been extraordinarily successful from the UN from the point of multilateral negotiations. So the climate change agreement in Paris, going into it, it was really touch and go whether an agreement of any sort would come out on something that's staring in the face and is going to change the lives of all our grandchildren. The Sustainable Development Goals is another. We have coming up in a couple of weeks the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and we're in the midst of a massive humanitarian crisis. There are more displaced people in the world now than there were at the end of the Second World War. Right? So there are a number of these things, and in some ways on those, the less headliney stuff, in some ways, the UN has actually been recently spectacularly successful, rather to its own surprise, I must say. So that's where, the other thing that is always odd to me, talking to an audience in the US, anywhere else in the world, generally, talk about the United Nations and peace will have a positive view, and what they read in the newspapers or anywhere else is positive. It's not the case in the United States, although it was so important. The United States in the early days of the United Nations made the UN what it was. I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just got under the wire before the Cold War settled in. It's actually funny because very shortly after that you had senators proclaiming that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written on pink paper, right? In other words, it was sort of communist and socialist inspired. And it's sort of been downhill ever since in some ways. But the reality is, of course, that the UN has always worked best when the US has been positively engaged. And as it has in the last couple of representatives of the US at the UN, and as we keep our fingers crossed as we come to some political changes coming up. Please. Mm-hmm. I was trying to find, there was a phrase where I got the closest to it, I think. And it was in this area of thinking about why people do things and how they do it. And in some ways, I think what we're talking about, yes, I talked about things that shape policymakers' inspiration, motivation, strategies and methodologies. And so I'm being very unspecific, but I think very deliberately, because it's actually the reality of what's going on in people's heads that I'm trying to connect with, right? And whatever that is to them, I want to connect to it. So it isn't, which is not to say that, you know, there is no truth and everything is relative and all of these kinds of things. Although our approach to that and some of the things that Paul quoted on earlier on is that our approach to truth tends to be that we're going to get as close as we can, but actually we're probably never going to quite get there. You know, for the mathematicians among us, there's something sort of almost asymptotic about it. You can get really, really close, but you can never quite get there, perhaps. And it's actually a constant search for trying to make our definition of what is right, what is true, as close as we can get to it. But the reality of that is saying, though, perhaps primarily, that it's not about trying to take our sense of values and impose them on others. That it's actually trying to reach out and see where people are, see what their motivators are. And you can express this in totally non-values and non-religious terms as just a negotiation theory, if you like, which is just finding out what's going on inside people's heads and trying to connect with it and starting from that common ground. I will say, I mean, the one thing that I did hint at is this notion of fundamental values. And again, I was trying to be non-specific, but I rather thought I might get called on it, but there's something there about the human experience where I think there are commonalities. And, you know, I mean, you can go on to a sort of a philosophical kind of line and look at in how many religions the golden rule, you know, do as you would be done by is expressed. And it's certainly there in many, many religions, but not necessarily all. But the reality is that most people, I think, have a certain sense of when it comes to what should or should not be done to human beings, particularly if it's a human being right in front of them, not far away somewhere, then you tend to reach a lot of common ground quite quickly, if you can find ways of expressing that in humanitarian terms and not necessarily in theoretical or political or ideological terms. Does that help? I'm sure I'm not really answering your question. I have one in the back and I'll come to you. I think that's right. It's very pragmatic. That's the thing. It's very pragmatic and it's very real, and you need to keep it at that level. Please.
My moment has passed because the
Oh.
conversation. That makes just two very quick points. One is with respect to trying to find common good that we can all agree upon. It really is very, I think, socially determined. Much of the world is still very strongly clan, tribe, and family oriented, rather than nation identification. And in many societies, and in even industrial societies, bountiful family life is translated to be a strong patriarchal dictatorship, where women are obedient. Without that, the family cannot survive in the minds of many, many people in the world. And that is something that is so highly sensitive in this country. And in fact, it's not even unanimous views of that in this country as well. That trying to reach out to some of the most egregious violations of what we regard as uncompromisable human rights run up against that law. With respect to common world things, I just want to remind some of the older people in the room, if you were in elementary school in the 50s, you may remember singing the United Nations song, which was published by the, we're the United Nations of the world, in peace and freedom we stand. Freedom from want, from fear, freedom to speak and pray. I won't get the melody. Each man in his own way. Freedom to fight for equal rights for all. In strength and freedom we stand. We work together, brother, all are we in the land of liberty. And that was the song that kids sang in elementary schools. And I thought maybe it was an artifact of my school. But as I talked to other people from that era, they remember the song. And that sticks in your head in my head after 60 years. But there was sort of the notion that rational examination of morality can come to the true answer.
Yes.
One of the things that we've taken as we've become, I guess, a post-Freudian world is that we really are less confident in the ability of reason to deduce for us, or for us to deduce through reason, what is proper moral standards. And so I think the crisis the United Nations faces and some of these international organizations is it is conflicted by the notion of pushing for at least common decent standards versus the need to respect traditions of hundreds and thousands of years developed. And it's, as you can see, United Nations military forces that are located around the world have been pilloried in the press for sexual abuse of people they're supposed to be protecting, for the unanticipated spread of disease, of cholera in Haiti, simply because of lack of concern. In fact, the troops were warned about putting latrines near drinking water sources, and they said, that's the way we always do it. And so these sorts of things jar us into realizing the world may not be like a clockwork we can fix. And so it requires people with goodwill and faith in progress to accept more setbacks than we thought would be possible or necessary in the 21st century. A lot less optimistic century than the 20th century, or late 20th century.
Yes. And if I could just pick up on a couple of things, and you'll wave at me when I'm running out of time, won't you? Soon. Good, I'm glad I checked. So, firstly, because I think this issue of, and it's the same in some ways, that there's been far more press in the US related to these recent bad things going on, the UN related to all the good things. But nevertheless, they are very bad things. Now, what happens, of course, is we look at the chain of how you end up with people wearing UN blue helmets in the field. So the Security Council looks at a particular situation and decides that something may need to be done. And so they decide that there will be a peacekeeping mission in country X or situation Y. And there's a whole set of rules about how and why that meant to be happen. What they're not is an aggressive military force. They are there to keep a peace that has already occurred, ideally. But they may be there also in humanitarian situations in some ways, which is the Haiti one. Now, there is no standing army. There is no standing military of any sort at a UN level. So what happens, the Security Council says this must happen, and then the Secretary General picks up the phone and starts making calls. And he's making calls for money, he's making calls for equipment, and he's making calls for troops. Now, it used to be that peacekeepers were sort of Canadians and Danes and, all these sorts of folk. Now, they're from Bangladesh, they're from Ghana, they're from many other, many South Asian countries, which is in fact a wonderful development in many ways. It's more countries around the world taking responsibilities for these things, but it does mean that the training that they have and all of these kinds of things is much less necessarily in accordance with international standards, although to the extent that it can be done, it is done. But there's probably a great deal more still of training and things like that needs to happen. There are also each of those troop contributing countries, then, even though there's a mandate set out by the Council, then they do deals with the Secretary General. Say, well, we like this bit, we don't like that bit, so we're not going to go out at night, or we're not going to do these other things. And it gets very, very messy very quickly. Nevertheless, the revelations of what had been going on in the Central African Republic and other places, and by the way, not just by developing countries as well, but one or two OECD countries providing troops have also been clearly had troops doing things that they shouldn't be doing. This is something that is now getting a great deal of attention. We've just had interviews with the first set of Secretary General candidates for the elections coming up, and it was a question that was asked of each of them as to what they were going to do about it. And it is something that is appalling and needs focus. The question I think that I got a little bit from the human rights kind of side of it, and the question of standards and what is or is not universal is a very interesting and difficult one. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that process was actually, the way it was put together, was very much intended to be a universal one. So they absolutely did go to everyone they could think of to write to and reach from different religions and different countries to try and bring it all in at that point in time. And I think still, it's still really important, I think, that there is a universal set of standards on some basis. Nevertheless, that actually it does take you into difficult places. For us and in the peace-building world, for example, there's very much a feeling that always where possible, and we keep on repeating this in the UN circumstances, listen to the local people, see what they actually want, see what they need. But on the other hand, what they want and need and believe may not be in accordance with the Declaration of Human Rights. So particularly if you survey African countries about what they think about gender issues and same-sex marriage and all of this, you're going to get a lot of answers that you don't necessarily like. So you have to, in some ways, say, yes, you have to empower, but you have to still be within some sort of a framework. And as if there is a framework you can point to that does have some measure of universal legitimacy, it's really, really important in that kind of sense. I'm sorry, you had a...
villages back together and coordinate construction. Well, she mentioned to me that she doesn't see a lot of young people that are from at least the United States college community getting involved in being a part of what you're talking about because they're just not interested or they haven't been approached, haven't gotten that kind of exposure. And I guess what I'm asking is the UN making steps to try and get young people that are like in this college community or in other, young people that have a different mindset, that have the social media mindset, that understand different things that perhaps the older generation doesn't, that would be able to infiltrate and add to.
So a couple of things. There is, there is also the Peace Corps still. We have UN Volunteers is another organization that does things. Within the US and beyond, there are the model UNs, which actually remain wonderfully very, very popular. Part of the challenge, though, these days is actually finding a model that feels right. So taking groups of effectively, rich college students from the global north into vacation trips in the global south doesn't feel right anymore. So what then is the model to get people to feel there, to get that experience, and yet to be doing it in a sort of a different values framework that has them very much respecting what they're seeing and accompanying and coming into it with sort of a humility. And it's quite hard to get that right. Now, I think partly one problem we've had is that the pendulum has sort of swung towards a place where typically it's hard to get those sorts of postings unless you are clearly offering a particular skill. But we still want to find the ways to make the connection with people and with young people and others. So I'm not sure we're quite there yet. But we need working on it. But I think coming from communities like this of saying we want to be able to connect in some way and forcing the UN to continue to respond. So thank you.
report. Well anticipated. I wanted to thank President Legault for his very kind, very thoughtful remarks, always very thoughtful at the beginning of these events. And also Andrew Tomlinson for his speaking and his coming here and his sharing all of these experiences and insights with us. And before we go to a reception out beyond the doors, I also wanted to take a moment to thank the Humanities Division and its support of this program, and especially Paula Craig, without whom this program would have been probably produced in Microsoft Word and would have looked and Andrew and Ursula would have been somewhere stranded between Turtle Bay and Bloomfield at this point in the afternoon. She has been taking care of all of these details and also really, quite frankly, keeping me compos mentis this year. So my thanks to her and to all of my colleagues in the division and to our guests. And please do join us for a reception and opportunities to talk and ask more questions.
I'm a lower ranking officer in an NGO, the World Technopolis Association, Korea, which is like the yes. We're trying to bring technology to the urbanization to create sustainable, finished cities that are going all over.